Perfect. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the California Water Data Consortium's June 2026 Data for Lunch inside California's open data ecosystem. I'm Elisa Salonis-Centric, the Senior Communications and Outreach Manager at the consortium. And today's session is a special format. Instead of a single presenter, we have a panel of 3 leaders who, between them, represent 2 of California's open data portals that are relevant to environmental work, as well as a super user perspective. So this topic has been one of the most requested by you folks, and it's obviously easy to see why. With so many resources out there, how do we navigate the open data platforms and data sets effectively and efficiently? And how do we prepare ourselves for the future? This year, we're also celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, AB 1755. But today, we're not only celebrating what's been built, but we're having a conversation about the gaps, the challenges, and the opportunities ahead. So this is also going to be an interactive session. We want to hear from you, not just talk at you. And we'll have some polling questions throughout and some time for Q&A. So for those familiar with Mentimeter, keep your browser window handy or your phone nearby. Our goal for today is simple, that you leave with more clarity than you came in with about what's available to you, what's coming, and what you can do to help shape it. So while we wait for folks to log on and get settled, I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping and the agenda. Yes, this meeting is being recorded and will be sent out via email, posted on our website and on YouTube. We have several audience polls throughout the presentation, like I mentioned, so that it'll just help us understand where you all are in the context of open data portals and what questions you might have. Questions are obviously welcome throughout the event. Feel free to drop them into the Zoom chat. My colleague Avery is online and we'll be collecting those. And then there's a brief post-event survey when the event ends or when you close out your window. So if you could answer that, that would be super helpful. This is today's agenda. Robin will frame the discussion up and ask a few audience questions to help orient the panel. The panel will be about 50 minutes or so. And then additionally, our wonderful panelists have agreed to stay on Zoom for your questions and an informal discussion at about 1:10. So again, feel free to pop your questions throughout the presentation of the panel into the Zoom chat throughout the event. And for those less familiar with the consortium, we're an independent nonprofit created through a partnership between state agencies and non-state entities. Our mission is to catalyze innovative water management through advancement and use of open data, especially in the face of climate change. And we do this by bringing people and institutions together to share ideas, synthesize information, and design smarter ways to use and share data. Our work spans research, tool development, hosting webinars and panels like this one, shaping policy recommendations, and helping our community come together around a shared vision for open data and climate resilience. Avery's going to pop our website into the chat if you want to learn more. And of course, you're all here today because you know about our Data for Lunch series. That's just one way we fulfill our mission. If this is your first time attending, welcome. You can also drop that into the chat so we can give you a little shout out. But Avery will drop some links into the chat to see where you can learn more about our past events. We also have a YouTube playlist with all of our past recordings there too. And I did mention earlier that we have another event coming up later this month with Upstream Tech, exploring how machine learning is generating reliable stream flow forecasts across California's unmonitored watersheds. So that's on the 17th, again at this lunchtime hour, and you can register at the link in the chat. Our virtual events are always recorded and posted on YouTube. So if you can't make it, register anyways. That way you'll get all of the materials in your inbox. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the California Department of Water Resources, Stantec, Environmental Science Associates, and Metropolitan Water District of Southern California for making this Data for Lunch series possible. If you or your organization are interested in sponsoring future Data for Lunch events or appearing on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me directly for more information. Abe is going to drop a link to the sponsorship flyer in the chat. Now I'm actually going to pass this over to Robin and give her the floor to cue us up for the framing of this discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elisa. And I'm really thrilled about the panel that we've pulled together today. And so thank you to the three of you for opening yourselves up for this discussion and sharing your knowledge about our state's open data ecosystem with everybody on the call. And as Elisa already emphasized, we really do hope this is a two-way street. So while I have some prepared questions for our panelists, we very much welcome questions and comments from the audience. And I will be asking you all to play along with some Menti polling in a short while. Um, our three panelists today really sit at different nodes of California's open data ecosystem and represent a really unique cross-section of perspectives. I appreciate that Elisa pointed out it's been 10 years since passage of the Open and Transparent Water Data Act in California. And there's been a lot of tremendous progress along the goals of that particular piece of legislation in the sense that we really have seen a huge amount of data make it out into the federated data portals. And there's been so many folks involved in that work, and it's really something to be celebrated. So we want to do a little bit of that, kind of talk about the capabilities and data sets that are now available and how they're being kind of put to use. And we want to have a forward-looking conversation too about, where can we go from here and what is there left to do. So really excited to have Katie with us from the California Department of Technology. She can kind of speak from the perspective of data.ca.gov, the state's general open data portal, which is a clearinghouse for data across all state agencies and domains, with a long-term vision of also harvesting from local government open data portals to become really a true statewide clearinghouse. We've also got David Harris from Natural Resources Agency, and he can speak to the CNRA data portal and the work that's happened there. And that portal is really focused on serving water and natural resource data consumers, built out through AB 1755 and AB 725 implementation. And it's part of this federated system of state platforms that are intended to work together. One thing that's happening, though, in the conversation now around the state's open data ecosystem is that we're shifting from a perspective of just getting the data out there, publishing the data, to asking how can we ensure that the data really gets used and integrated and built upon more effectively. And so we're really glad to also have Lucy with us, who is kind of can represent and speak to DWR's open science work, which is a little bit of a newer frontier that thinks beyond the data publication piece and really gets towards this integration of open data with open source software, software developer kits, and research on computational infrastructure. So this is part of a broader interagency collaborative that involves roughly 20 water agencies that Lucy can tell us a little bit more about. And I just want to give a little more background. That was sort of overview of the perspectives each one is bringing. I do want to give a little bit more background and bio info on our speakers because it really is an impressive group. So kind of going backwards, Lucy Andrews is a senior environmental scientist at the California Department of Water Resources. She's co-leads development of the scientific data system for the Healthy Rivers and Landscape Science Program, which is an interagency collaboration focused on restoring California's rivers and landscapes. And she has a PhD from UC Berkeley, where she developed computational methods for stream monitoring and river restoration, excuse me. So she's bringing kind of both the research and the engineering perspective today to today's conversation. David Harris is the enterprise data manager at the California Natural Resources Agency's data center. He has been one of the key architects behind AB 1755 implementation. He also serves on our steering committee. Thank you, David. And he provides consultation and systems development support to the team building California's water data infrastructure. He's led product management for the CNRA Open Data Platform, one of three of the federated platforms we're discussing today, and brings decades of state government technology experience, including building California's first online public campaign finance disclosure system. So he really does know what it takes to move a major data initiative from concept to production. And then finally, we have Katie Regan with us. She's been serving as the State Data Services Manager at the California Department of Technology. Her team oversees geospatial services, data management standards, and strategic data initiatives across state government. Before joining the state, Katie built the Office of Performance and Data Analytics for the city of Stockton from the ground up, focused on data governance, open data, and making analytics frameworks for equitable service delivery. So, as you're thinking about questions for Katie, keep in mind that she's got both this local government expertise and experience, and the experience at the state level, which gives her a really distinctive vantage point. And we're excited to have all three of you with us today. So that's enough talking for me. I think much better to hear from the three of you. We did ask each of our panelists to take 3 to 5 minutes to respond to the same kind of opening question. And so I'm going to go to that question now, and we'll start, Lucy, with you. But the question is, what is a recent advancement in California's open data landscape that you wish more people knew about? And what do you think needs to happen most urgently as the next step?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So thanks for kicking us off with that, Robin. Something that I'm excited about as I sit in state government and observe the way that my colleagues and I are thinking about data and, taking AB 1755 as our foundation and contemplating how we move beyond it is I'm seeing a sort of perspective shift from thinking about open data as a compliance requirement driven by a statutory mandate and moving now into a paradigm where we're understanding open data as core public infrastructure and treating it as such, both in how we resource it and how we govern it, and how we discuss it with leadership and with our partners and collaborators and sort of the general public more broadly. And as Robin mentioned, I work on the Healthy Rivers and Landscapes program, which is an interagency effort to bring broad scale habitat restoration and environmental flow deployment to the Sacramento River watershed, to the east side tributaries, and to the Bay Delta estuary. And in this work, we've got a science program where we've developed 55 hypotheses to drive monitoring such that we can study the impacts of these interventions with restoration environmental flows to figure out if it's working to bring back some of our native fish populations and think about how we can adaptively manage to really maximize how we deploy these assets for our aquatic ecosystems. And that really depends on this sort of foundational layer of gathering data about what's happening in our environment and at our sort of infrastructure interventional points, and then synthesizing it to produce insights. And to do that, there needs to be this enabling infrastructure, sort of this middle layer that takes all of our data and sort of appreciates metadata and the ways that those are made open and public on things like the CNRA and broader California data portal, but then also moving them into sort of an open science ecosystem where we can take data and ask questions of it in ways that are efficient and really well documented and reproducible. And so data in that model is infrastructure. It's not just checking a box in a regulatory paradigm. And so for me, the most urgent thing that we can do moving forward is to treat open data as our starting line, not our finish line, and think about it as one critical component of a broader open ecosystem that empowers research and management. And so the portals can be sort of a front door to a broader system of tools and collaborative forums. I think a lot about how we can trace data to decisions in the scientific framework. And so that requires that we start to engage with things like persistent identifiers so that data sets become citable and trackable through sort of chains of analysis and thinking and decision making. It also means engaging with the friendliness of our data provision, such that for me, that means working toward improved and more user-friendly application programming interfaces, a greater degree of curation for science and decision making, software developer kits, so providing people with things like R packages and Python packages to grab data easily so that folks don't have to write relatively complex API-facing code, and then ultimately open source code bases so that we start to connect our open data to open analysis that is reproducible and that allows other people to build on it. So in my language, that would be extensible analysis. Because I ultimately think open science and open source and open data work can be a way to sit in the messiness of California's conflicts around water and ecosystems, and have really respectful discussions that are rooted in what we can observe in our data and then drive a lot of our scientific questions to make adaptive management more real in public facing work. So those are some of my initial thoughts, and I'm excited to hear what my colleagues on the panel have to say.
Yeah, very beautifully said in many instances. So I'm glad we're recording this. I'm going to kick it over to David. next, and then we'll go to Katie.
Thanks very much. So we've reached this important milestone of having the AB 1755 data sets readily available on a page on open data platform of CNRA, and it's the water page. And I agree with Lucia, that's kind of table stakes. That's the beginning. There's an interesting concept called ephemeralization, and it's a term for, if you haven't happened to have heard about it before, it's the trend in human invention to move from creating things that are more material dense and low embedded intelligence towards things that are lighter, less mass oriented, and more knowledge intensive. So, for example, in transportation, we go from huge ships to trains to planes, and through that evolutionary path, uh, each level has less mass involved and more knowledge. It's really interesting to think about what does that trend mean for government? How might government services evolve to become more information and knowledge dense and less material dense? It's fun to think out, in 40 years, how do we think that might have progressed? You mentioned one with UC Berkeley. One of my favorite past examples that I think is wildly successful government initiative to create more knowledge density, and that is the Master Plan for Higher Education that established California's JC state and UC system. It got copied all over the world, and I think has been an amazing engine for California already. So it'll be fun to see how we integrate data and analytics into all our work. And so my answer for what's most urgent right now is training and support for folks who are already too busy to get up that learning curve to take advantage of the new visibility and understanding we can have with data.
Well, I saw one person loved that idea, and you're getting thumbs up, so I think that's resonating. And I love that I learned a new term already today, ephemeralism. That's great. All right, Katie, over to you.
David, I don't know if you intentionally did this, but that was like the perfect queuing up of my response. The end point that you noted about the UC and junior college system, and that is where I am most excited. And I don't know if advancement is the appropriate word to label this on, but again, thank you, Robin and team, for having me here. And it's very humbling to sit next to Lucy and David. I am the generalist amongst this crew. So at data.ca, of course, we are this like broader sense of state data without subject matter ownership. So we are the enabler across the state and not the data owner. But calling back to the UC system, community colleges, CSUs, where I'm most excited and what they're, something that's on CDT's open data team's radar is leveraging the fact that we are all within the state organization and plugging open data into curriculum across those levels of university and education, putting the state's open data in the hands of our students at like their earliest entry. So I really, it has the opportunity to span so many different types of courses to not only make our data at the state more relevant to students, get a direct feedback loop on quality, usability, right? These kind of dimensions of is the data worth being out in the environment? And then also enabling and hopefully incentivizing students with this opportunity to tailor their learning experience to topics that really matter to them. So if you can imagine in an introduction to statistics course, instead of having to use the like standardized data set that comes in a textbook, I, as a new student, can instead turn to the Open Data Portal, I care about water data, as does this group, and I can pull machine readable, ready to go data off of the portal and do my schoolwork with that. Like, I think that this has such synergy and reciprocity. Like, there's so much to be done in this space. And so this is an advancement that we're working towards. There's a longer road to get there, but I think one of the urgent kind of immediate steps is doing, and what the team is currently working on is a quality assessment of what is currently on the portal. If we approach professors and students, we want to make sure that we're approaching them with is worth them using. And there is a lot of data that is not just like right off the shelf for any average user. And so there's also an opportunity for us as the organizer of data here to kind of rank and categorize data for a user base that meets them where they're at. How can we help folks find data that meets them as a brand new data neophyte, as opposed to someone, Lucy, in your shoes that is well understanding of what is going on, and it's just like at the ultimate maturity level for data user. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to kind of keep it on within the space and getting students engaged earlier and earlier.
I love that that connects also back to this concept of sort of training and workforce development. The more that students are, asked to engage with these systems earlier on in their careers and their learning pathways, the more they come into whatever jobs they take on with a sense of familiarity and know-how, which is great. Um, so we wanted to thank you all for responding to that initial opening question and giving everybody in our audience a sense of who you all are and how, the perspective you're bringing into this conversation. We'd love to pause and panelist questions for a second and sort of turn that lens back on all of you that are with us today, and just for our sake, get a better sense of kind of who's in the room and what your experience is with the state's open data portals. So if you're willing to play along, we'd love for you to use your phone, use the QR code, or go to menti.com and enter in that code and just give us a sense of who's here and what your level of familiarity is or experience is with the open data portals. And I've been told I rushed through these Menti polls, so I will try and give everyone a little more time than I have in the past. Thank you all for joining in. It's great to see so many folks that actually use them often in their day-to-day job. It's wonderful. And some regular submitters in the room as well. That's great.
Sorry if my visual keeps switching back and forth. I don't know what's
Yeah,
happening.
I was going to ask, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
You've got about 15 seconds.
Okay, great. So some folks who are going to be newer and coming into this conversation from more of a perspective of learning what's there and how they can be used, and then also it looks like some more expert users who may have some more nuanced questions about where we can take these systems next. So that's really wonderful to have that mix in the room, and thank you all for being here. We have two more questions for you. We're curious what the tools and technologies are that you use around that data. If you are in the category of somebody who does extract data from the data portals in a more regular way, where does that data go? And what are you integrating it within? Oh, I hadn't seen them. One of them looks like a grape for a second there. That was cool. I like this visualization. Okay, good mix across these different tools as well. Decent number of folks still downloading into spreadsheet format, and then some that are going into programming tools, GIS and mapping tools. slightly smaller number of folks, it looks like, that interact with it in the kind of dashboards, business intelligence tools, platforms, or APIs and web services, things like that on the bottom row. Very helpful. Lisa, what do we give it another 15 to 20? Okay.
Yeah.
All of the above. So we're getting some comments that I don't know if folks were capable of choosing multiple, but it looks like we were allowing just three. So noted that a lot of you are doing all of the above. That's great to hear, and thanks for letting us know in the chat. Okay, so last question. This is a word cloud question. We're just curious to understand, the folks that are with us today, which data sets do you tend to interact with most? And understand there's probably quite a few that you could name here as well. So maybe pick your favorite or your favorite few. I love watching these word clouds reform themselves as more responses come in. CDEC, a clear winner here. Looks like, there's a couple different ways to speak to groundwater data. So some folks are saying Sigma, others are saying groundwater. But that seems to be a popular one as well. EAR, really fascinating. Good diversity. Very cool. Okay, yeah, some land use coming up as a popular one as well, combined with crop mapping, kind of similar category there. Great. Well, thank you all. That's very helpful. You're welcome to continue putting in some responses there because we're collecting that data on our end, and we'll share back out after the fact. So please feel free to keep responding. Um, and thanks for helping us kind of have a better sense of who's with us today. It's really helpful as we go into the dialogue a little bit more. So a place I wanted to start with, maybe especially for folks like myself, even when I was coming into this work, I had the same question, which is the Open and Transparent Water Data Act envisions sort of the single portal, single access point, and it ended up that we have this sort of federated system, and we've used that term a couple of times already today. And so, David, I was hoping you could help kind of define that for us. What do we mean by federation? And can you explain a little bit kind of how we got here and why it matters and just your perspective on that choice and where the state is at in that sense?
Yeah, glad to. So when we started design for the CNRA Open Data Platform, the first thing that happened was we had a line of vendors who wanted to sell us their silo, or I'm sorry, their monolithic data solution that would solve all of our problems. And but they were all proprietary, and it was it's hard to appreciate now how unusual it was that we discarded that approach and we decided to go with a more open architecture. And there are operational reasons to do that. It's really great to be able to have a system that plugs together based on open standards, kind of like Legos. So you can use best of breed any particular category. But it was also really critical that we have an open architecture because we were planning on getting data from all over. And federation is where instead of having a centralized monolithic design, you have all these different silos and separate pools of information, and you connect them together with data standards. And all anybody has to agree to is that standard for sometimes there's some initial data collection according to a structure like a metadata standard. Um, but that common thread allows you to plumb across the silos. So the way that works with the open data platforms is that there's multiple sources. There's a ton of federal sources. There's our departments across Natural Resources Agency, and using a metadata standard, we're able to collect that from each of those sites. And what Federation does is it creates a layer on top of all those separate silos that makes them viewable and appear as one. So you can search them all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only thing that moves around is that descriptive data that gives you the query, and then the search results. The data stays right in its home. The root for the word authoritative includes the creator. And that was the philosophy that we adopted. We wanted to keep the data as close to the author as possible. So that general principle of connecting things together using data standards and APIs, open APIs, has let us do a lot of powerful things. One of the ones that people aren't all aware of is even in the open data platforms standard, we also run in parallel geospatial data services as a network. And we harvest from those not just the pointers to that geospatial data, but also services that are generated in the geospatial network. So, which is a really wonderful thing where you can take a link or an assortment of links you get from different sources, drop them in a map viewer, and instantly overlay all those layers. So, yeah, the benefits of an open approach are huge. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to create this data services ecosystem that is coming together now.
Very helpful. Thank you. Any other points, Katie or Lucy, that you would add to that definition?
Only cheering for the adoption of an open source stack. I think that as stewards of public dollars, it's really important to make sure that we are not adopting exclusively proprietary technologies that are inaccessible to collaborators and that other people can't build on. And I approach a lot of data work and research, software engineering work from a pretty deep commitment to open source. And I think that that's really important for government to center, given our role in the ecosystem of managing data and infrastructure and software assets.
Well, that was a great segue actually into the next question I wanted to ask you, Lucy, which is that you alluded to work that you're engaged in and that others are engaged in to help kind of move even beyond open data towards an open science ecosystem. And I'd love for you to just speak a little bit to sort of what that really looks like in practice. Any barriers that you and others are encountering in that space currently, and what the sort of art of the possible is there?
That's such a fun question. To broadly define open science for folks, I can imagine that everybody brings their own definition and perspective on what open science is and what it can be. But for me, some of the sort of simplest articulation is allowing folks to go from a question, scientific question typically, to credible evidence without having to reverse engineer a system of how the question moved to data, moved to analysis, moved to conclusion, right? None of that should be obscured, and it should be reproducible, meaning that other people can click go on an analysis, for example, and get to the same spot. That requires a great degree of documentation. It requires a lot of attention to how you structure computer code and how you publish it and what you sort of wrap it in for reproducibility. But ultimately, if we do that, we can rebuild our own work in 5 years. Other folks can take our work and perform rigorous peer review, which is an important part of science. Other people can build on analysis in, research terms, fork an analysis and change it and, come to their own conclusions or expand on the question that was originally asked. And to really move toward an open science ecosystem, it requires that a lot of information is machine readable, which is pretty important from these portals. That we aren't doing manual downloads and manipulating information in Excel spreadsheets, for example. That's typically not reproducible. Um, and that folks are open to collaboration, right? An open ethos invites participation. It doesn't close off knowledge or the questions that people ask. And that can often bring up friction points, right? In science, in water management, in ecosystem management. And my hope for the state of California, and at least the program that I work on, is that science can be this convening point where a lot of these tensions and various perspectives and needs can be brought into the same room. And we may not all agree, but hopefully through the process of asking questions together, engaging with peer review, making sure that our work is accessible to each other, we can arrive at a fruitful relationship in working together. But the biggest barrier to open science is that it's not any single skill set, right? It requires scientific expertise, of course, domain expertise, but it also requires information technology expertise. Thank goodness Katie's here. It requires folks who are attuned to data governance and how we have decision-making processes and roles and responsibilities for working with and managing data. It requires data engineering, so folks who can actually create these pipelines that deliver data and information. And it requires communication and facilitation and empathy, which can be challenging when folks, have a task list that's 85 items long and only so many hours in the day. So it's pretty easy to under-resource open science and not make it anybody's particular responsibility. And so we ultimately have to find ways to address the human dimension of open science and help everyone understand that this is a shared commitment and help people have resources to understand what we mean by open science and have tools to operationalize it and to make it the easiest path rather than something that requires additional labor to actually implement. And then we'll ultimately need this broader ecosystem to emerge, such that if we're developing open source tools, there are other people in universities and in private companies and in other levels of government that are working with us to build and maintain and expand on open tools that we produce. So that's my 2 cents on open science.
That was really helpful. And one thing that kind of came to mind as you were starting out your description there about the groundwork that has to happen to make it all move forward is that it's sort of like go slow at first to then move fast, right? Because if you've laid that groundwork, that you can really accelerate the pace of scientific discovery and learning because you're doing it in this collaborative way. But it does take a lot of, tedious change and investment on the front end. I do wonder, as a follow-up to your remarks, one thing that I think folks also sometimes encounter as a barrier is sort of fear of sharing data sets and like a perfectionism around, wanting to make sure that they're as high quality as possible and sort of well contextualized and all of that. Can you speak to that tension at all? And then I'd also invite, Katie and David to add anything to this question and conversation.
I live in that tension every day. Part of my work is, the joy of relatively unfettered scientific research, and part of my life is living in a regulated environment, right? Where the ways that data are marshaled in a regulatory context can be very weighty and consequential. And for me, a lot of that question comes back to, in a technical term, what I would call provenance, allowing people to understand how data came to be the way that it is, from the point of data collection in the field to its entry into a database system, to processes of cleaning and validation, ultimately then to its delivery through some kind of data service, and then how it's manipulated into information and decision making. I don't think we're ever going to arrive at perfect data, but having this sort of broader way of tracking that whole evolution, documenting quality management. Shout out to my DWR colleagues who work in quality management. They do incredible work every day. That is really important. And I think where we often suffer is in that documentation part. Not that we don't have standards or supports for it, but that it takes an incredible amount of time to document data sets well. And it's often the case that documentation is the thing that suffers when people are short on time. So I'm with colleagues exploring ways to accelerate the production of documentation. I think we'll get to it later. I think there's a lot of there's a role for large language models and agentic systems there, approached with care. And a lot of documentation can be templated, can be pipelined, but of course, setting that up takes time.
Right.
And then I think, there's always a negotiation between, in the human emotion side, between sort of fear of criticism or fear of information be taken out of context, but then also this desire for scientific progress that depends on data that we put into the public domain. And so I think continuing to have places where people can talk about that is really important, rather than sort of burying that emotional landscape. I think that often is unfruitful.
Yeah, really wonderful insights. Anything else from Katie or David on that topic?
I'll add that a lot of it is just about getting used to new ways of doing things and seeing things through new lenses. And there's a natural evolution in management practices where there's the new thing, and there's somebody who's the director of new thing, and they help everybody bootstrap through the process, and eventually that person loses their job because everybody's kind of absorbed it and figured it out. But usually there's a new thing, so that's okay. And so one of the things that's really amazing is to take advantage of that expression about how the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, and to look around and see where people have adopted data management. And one of the examples that touches my heart the most is the amazing transformation that was created in childhood cancer treatment, oncology. And I visited a clinic a long time ago, and there were two people in a little room, and I asked what they were doing, and those were the people who were managing the data. And it's like, this is like a 10-person staff, and they've got two people doing data. And it turns out that they're amazing data managers, and what their model was, they were going to learn from every kid, every single one. And so in effect, they weren't experimenting on kids, but they were learning, they were tracking all of them so they could learn from them. And as a result, childhood cancers have reduced dramatically. And it's really wonderful to see that. Cancers like leukemia have being a death sentence, basically over 90% mortality, I think. And now it's like better than outcomes for asthma. And they've absorbed that. It's just part of their normal way of doing business. And so I look forward to that happening in more areas.
It's a great reminder that this conversation is relevant, kind of across so many different domains. Not even though a lot of us live in the water space, there's probably lessons to be learned from others working on data for public outcomes, more generally, natural resources or otherwise. We're talking about kind of the lift and the capacities and sort of trust building and space for folks to learn to do something a new way. And Katie, I'd love to kind of turn to you now because you've seen open data work happen at the local, state, and federal levels. And so I'd love for you to just sort of talk a little bit about how you like what you've observed in those processes at those different scales. What are some of the gaps and sort of getting from a place of silos to a place of sharing and openness? And you also mentioned this idea of like a true clearinghouse for California. And so if you wanted to speak to that in answering this question, feel free to do so as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so much of what I feel like I just heard from both Lucy and David is this like pointer back to the foundations of data management, data quality is this, right? When we have a strong foundation, then it enables long-term growth, advancement, and sustainability of data over the course of it. David, I loved your director of new thing. And, like as new stuff comes online, having that strong foundation means that you get to move more confidently into new spaces. And so, I can imagine that everyone on the call will likely resonate with this example of, like to use a local government data space of policing and collection of police data. as much as you would imagine that there's consistency around the type of data that's collected and the field names for the data for it to get entered, it just, jurisdiction by jurisdiction exists in its own space. And so even though this is a very consistent type of data that exists across jurisdictions, just the nuance of the way that the field is named and the date is entered and the name being first and last versus last then first, right? It really changes the interoperability of that data jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I forget, I'm looking back through the chat because someone obviously nailed this, that the cleaning process. Okay, great, Ted. You noted that data QC and cleaning is like so much of the work of then doing analysis. So I think that a gap that exists kind of across jurisdictional and levels within government entities is just that foundational element of consistency of data where there is likeness. And there's so much opportunity to drive for data standards within topic areas so that there's like a semblance of interoperability of that data when there needs to be look across jurisdictions. Again, services to the unhoused community is another environment. Again, I not to call into like the data space that we are here with water. Any kind of qualms that exist in this space are so permeating across all of these other topic areas. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to come together in our respective topics and drive for data consistency through standards. And then Robin, you noted this up top, kind of like the breadcrumbs to what an ultimate clearinghouse at the state could look like. The way that there is a clearinghouse at the federal level at data.gov. This harvesting, David, that you mentioned earlier with our federated environment within CNRA's portal exists within the larger data.ca portal, larger just meaning the broader state perspective, pull data across these open environments to really drive for consistency. So again, if you go to the federal data.gov, you'll be able to find California's data present there because of this federated system. We have so many powerful data environments in local government settings that are currently not part of our state's data.ca.gov. And there's a lot of opportunity to move into that space where we start becoming a statewide, right, like the boundary of the state, all government entities that are publishing data at our defined data standard would be able to be identified and pulled in, harvested, and made available at data.ca. So I'm excited about that opportunity. There's again like a nice long roadway for us to get there, but hopeful that local jurisdictions will be able to see their data engaged at the state level so that we can be that clearinghouse.
Yeah, that would be really powerful. I think if we could get there and start integrating all of that data as well. Um, David, I want to come back to you because you mentioned this really kind of beautiful example of data being used to address childhood cancer risk. And so I want to ask a question about use cases. It's a term that I hear you use a lot. And I know it's something that kind of drives some of the work on the data portals. And so from where you sit, kind of thinking about data domains, natural resources, water management, what are some of the most important use cases that you've seen functionality built to support kind of in domains that are closer to home for this particular audience here today?
Yeah. What I think we're moving toward is just a pervasive embedded data flow environment. And so I'd say the most important one is just the one that every program manager is running right now. For them to be able to think of their information as an asset and to intentionally structure the flows and um, map out their use cases, for instance. so they can be super clear on their program's needs. Because that's the great thing about use cases. They're not really technical. They're about specifications and behaviors of the system according to what people need. Um, I think the first level is to have that programmatic comfort level with it. So they're more successful with their system implementations, even if it's just an amazing Excel spreadsheet. Um, and then the next level is to be able to then look at higher order questions we want to ask across the silos and map those use cases. Because the other thing that use cases are really great for is identifying flows of data.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's possible to start integrating those local program needs with perspective from across the silos.
Okay, great. I I think it's a good place to ask another Menti question of the audience, and also we're getting some questions in the chat, and we're noting those. We will make sure that we have some time for you all to ask your questions directly, and we can read them, or you can come off mute. For now, it'd be great to hear from you all. What features, functionalities, et cetera, would you like to see from the state's open data portals in the future? Kind of with this context in mind of sort of use cases and applications that you might have for these tools. And I don't know, Elisa, did we enable voting with this particular question?
No, we didn't.
Okay. So we're seeing API related commentary and from a few folks. Digital object identifiers got an upvote. User generated flags. Love that kind of potentially could take us down the road of talking about how people can provide input into the data sets that are up there. Someone says that they think you've given what we need, which is probably great to hear, David and Katie. On this theme of use cases, somebody notes use cases of published data would be helpful. Be curious if that particular person is thinking like a library functionality or how that would work in your mind. So maybe if you have additional thoughts, you could put them in the chat. Oh, some ability to see whether the data has been published in research. That's an interesting one too. Yeah. I'm curious from our panelists, is there anything that you're seeing here that sort of there's work ongoing towards any of these functionalities, or is there something that you're like, oh, I wish this person knew this already existed, that you'd want to call out or speak to as these results are coming in?
Well, this is kind of fun because I submitted some too. So some of these are my ideas, and it's great to see what other people are thinking about. I wasn't texting, I was working here. Um, I think the thing that I'm working on at DWR and sort of in interagency venues is trying to connect data and code bases. Um, I would love to see all of our code used to generate data, to document data, to establish its quality. Um, in open source repositories that are reproducible and hosted on GitHub that have things like tagged releases with semantic versioning that then flow into data that is published on the data portals. That's that provenance piece that I'm talking about.
Mhm.
That to me is very important. And I think a missing link in there as well is having the portals mint DOIs. That's something we've been talking about, and it's not straightforward, but it should be technically possible. And so the question would become, does CNRA become a DOI minting entity? Does CDT? So that we can connect DOI tagged code bases to the data products that have DOIs that come out of them, and refresh the data products on a more frequent interval because the code bases are there and well structured and reproducible. So for me, it's that broader system of saying, well, how do we get to the data and having all of the things underpinning it? So I don't know that that was an answer necessarily, but it is something that is on my mind.
Yeah, helpful. Thank you. David or Katie, anything that came across the screen there that you feel like there's a team working on it right now and it's worth sort of sharing out, or
We'll
agreement
say,
that there should
regardless
be?
of work ongoing, I'm excited to see so many folks interested in giving quality feedback. And by that, I mean feedback on the quality of the data that they just found, not that your feedback has to have a quality level in order to give it. Um, so that's great. I mean, I always am like thrilled to see any engaged user group. So that's awesome. I think that functionality is something that is pretty realistic in terms of, so as many of you maybe know, data.ca.gov is, we work with a vendor on like the user interface. There's those amount of limitations there, but it also is like cost savings for us at the state and hopefully to you all as us all as taxpayers. But I do think that this ability to like flag for quality is something that is really meaningful, and I think it's a lot of opportunity for feedback loop to the data publishing side of the house, which is really exciting. Also, the use case request, if I remember some of the wording that was in there, is like seeing how data has been used, seeing the ways that data is put into action. Um, that is a feature on the portal. A lot of what is currently highlighted in that space shows up as, David, what you were describing earlier, of the applications that are built out of the GIS environment. So again, there's this relationship between data.ca and then the GIS data. And so there's a lot of movement and highlighting of applications that exist that are kind of like user friendly, um, have GIS relationship.
Well, I think you kind of mentioned the quality flagging piece, and I feel like we can't not talk a little bit about AI today. And Lucy already brought it up as a potential tool with utility in that really work-intensive QA/QC aspect of data governance. And so I'll ask a broader question, but anticipate that Lucy, you may have some additional thoughts to share on that particular front. But this is a question to all of you, and we'll start with you, Lucy, is how are you thinking about AI readiness? So both from the perspective of AI ready data, model context protocol, things like that, but also utility of AI and appropriate and responsible use in the data governance from the data governance perspective.
I could talk about this for hours, so I'll do my best to be brief. And if folks want to bring it up also in our Q&A later with the audience, by all means. So I think about AI readiness as a forcing function in the sense that when you're preparing data and infrastructure for intersection with large language models and with agentic systems, it will expose all of the weaknesses in your data that humans have to deal with already and make them all the more apparent and worse. And so the challenge becomes that data that are fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, are not inherently AI ready. Those are actually different concepts. And FAIR is a part of AI readiness, but it is not the entire picture. AI readiness requires particular structures in data, particular standards, protocols for making data available. And it also requires a great degree of context. Throwing all of your data into a large language model or an agent and then saying, make sense of this is not going to work. And so thinking through how you contextualize information and then the sort of broader pattern of agent deployment, the skills that you're equipping agents with, the ways that you're thinking through permissions and security is really important. The other thing that I'll say is we don't right now in water data work, when thinking about using large language models and particularly agents, have a benchmarking framework to evaluate the quality of the outputs that we're getting. And benchmarking is non-trivial and a whole subject of academic research, but it would be interesting to think about developing benchmark data sets and benchmark frameworks for really structured workflows for more open world circumstances, so that as we're starting to think about providing data to agents, structuring their activities, and validating outputs, we have a common way of doing that so that folks are really able to interrogate this brand new world that we're in. Um, and the answer to that question changes every week, right? If anybody's paying attention, we had a sort of sea change in November of last year. And when I read, my large language model and AI digest in my email every morning, there's like something that happened overnight while I was sleeping that I now need to know about. So it's kind of fun to monitor. I'm also aware that these companies and the models that provide them are not simple in a democratic system. And so I think the other question that government will continue to need to ask is what is our role in engaging with frontier model providers and the broader political economy in which these technologies exist?
Yeah, 100%. Katie or David, who's eager to jump in on this particular question?
Katie.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Lucy, it's so clear that you work in a scientific space. It's so refreshing to hear the commitment to repeatable outcomes. I mean, that is right. Like everyone should take that note and run with it because I think what ends up happening a lot of the time is that at a like an executive level, there's this desire to, David, to use your previous director of the new thing, wants to see it happen and have all this efficiency gain because we've done a thing and it Lucy, like you described, it really ends up shining a light on where there are gaps in the foundational elements. I think one of the things that I'm finding to be the case is, it's a layer on top of this existing environment that we all live within. And so when there is context missing, Lucy, to your point about how context derived all of these tools are and need to be in order to work effectively, when we're missing elements of that contextual space, there's not a lot that can be done with them with this, newer technology layered on top. So what ends up happening is we're like, teams are getting put back, not necessarily at a starting line, but they're definitely needing to go back and do a lot of groundwork in order to then make the tool worthwhile. So it's like a great illustration of how important the basics are and that they are places to invest time because it will allow for acceleration and effective use of the newer technology that gets layered on top of our existing data environments. I also think that there needs to be a lot of energy put into, is the use of the technology worth what we're putting into it, worth the environmental spend of the larger, data center environment that is being a built infrastructure across, the globe. I think that there needs to be a really significant conversation happening around, is it worth us using this heavier technology? Are we getting meaningful outcomes in order to justify the type of spend across multiple dimensions of resources? Being able to speak to that, especially as government entities, if we are users of it, being able to speak to and defend to our public of why we have decided to use and pursue.
Mhm.
I see you about to say something, David, so I'm taking
Well,
a beat.
yeah, it might be better to save it for Q&A as people are
Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in. So I did want to kind of give you all one last sort of opportunity to any final kind of thoughts that you want to be sure that you shared, that you didn't, main takeaways that you want people to leave this conversation with. And then yes, I think we should turn to audience questions at this point because we've got some great ones. So David, I'll start with you.
All right. Yeah, this is a little random, but I just want to acknowledge the amazing technical team that supports the CNRA Open Data Platform. Matteo Rocker, Matt McFarland, Nabil Bandar. Those are the ones that make it happen. So, and I'll also just say, this is a hugely transformative shift and we don't know where all of it's going to even go yet. But we know it's always better to be smarter. So let's go for that.
Okay, great. Yes, and thank you to those that you mentioned and many others who have done a lot of hard work in this space over the last decade and longer. Katie.
Mine will be a caveat of everything I have said on this call has been my personal opinion and does not reflect. But with that being said, I mean, David, to your point, like all of this work is so deeply team oriented and is inherited over and over again. And so all who have come before and all that will follow up, it's just exciting to see how much it's built upon the incredible work that has been done and I know will continue to be done, especially as someone who is about to leave state service and move to local government work again at the county level. I will be excited to hopefully tack on to work that the state has done and will keep doing local jurisdictions.
You'll be missed at the state level and on our steering committee, but excited for your next move. Lucy.
Yeah, I appreciate that this panel has certainly inhabited a little bit of wonky space where we're talking about technology and data, but that also these human elements have really surfaced. Because I perhaps am overly optimistic, but I think that civic technology work can actually be the work of manifesting democracy if done right. I do the work that I do in government because I really care about civil service and I really care about California and everybody who lives here and all of the biological diversity that we have. And in order to really serve the public and do work that is democratic, we have to have our data house in order, and we have to do so in a way that's open. And I'm hoping that as we sort of explore this ongoing evolution and enabling infrastructure, we can find ways to continue to convene around it. And to think about, what is the modernizing state workforce that can do that work well? What are the human and communication and emotional intelligence skills that need to be there? And then what are the skill sets that we don't currently have thoroughly embedded at all departments to do things like moving from a project management paradigm to a product management paradigm, as entities like the US Digital Service have really been sort of shouting from the rooftops? Or how do we think about tools like, in my world, GitHub in an open source commitment to bringing other people into the fold? I would love for anybody on this call who writes computer code to develop software with me and hoping to build the infrastructure to do that. So if we can maintain a focus on the human to enable our sort of technological development, I think we'll be all the better for it.
What a perfect closing remark. And kind of, I want to thank all of the folks who are on this call for being a part of this particular convening on this topic, and for all the questions that you've written in the chat and submitted even ahead of time. So with that, I think we will go to them. We had a couple of questions that folks actually submitted as they registered. So I think maybe in fairness, I'll start with one or two of those and then go to some of the questions we've gotten along the way. And anybody, if I name you and you want to come off mute and sort of add any nuance to your question, please feel free to do so and let us know and we can do that. So Nick Rollins actually had a Zoom registration question and a question in real time. So maybe I'll read both of them. His first one is, in CNRA Open Data, there is a Showcases tab, but I haven't seen an example of it used. What is the intention for that feature? And how could data stewards use it more effectively? And he also asked, it's not directly related, but I'll just read both of them. You can define the best standards and processes for folks to use, but how do you actually encourage uptake by the myriad interested parties that are involved in the data lifecycle, especially in complicated and diverse systems where people are already strapped for time? So I think that kind of goes to your training remark earlier, David. And since he calls out the CNRA data portal, I'm going to turn to you to answer those questions in whatever order you choose.
Yeah. So that one ribbon that goes across is focused on applications that consume the data and they link to it. And there's more that can be done there. It'd be fun to see subject matter expert areas or communities of practice contribute to that, to prioritize the ones I think that are more useful. And that also could be a place to point related things about code out. And for instance, you're talking about code, Lucy, that could be a code acting on a particular data set could be in there too. So there's definitely more we can do, but it's super dependent on the subject matter expertise. So I'd encourage more participation in that somehow.
In the showcases tab, this is what you're speaking to. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And what was the second part of the question?
Yeah, he had also asked that, we can define the best standards and processes
Oh,
for,
right.
for folks to use, but
Yeah.
how do we actually encourage uptake?
That's a really tough one. One of my favorite data jokes is about how standards are really great. That's why there's so many of them. And there's this not invented thing here that people are very vulnerable to. And a lot of time, like even on metadata, that's totally dependent on interoperability with other sites. So many standards have been created. And so what we can do is encourage that. And so we have a data standard field uh, in our metadata standard. And I think it'd be really great if we did subject matter specific dropdowns on that, where uh, instead of having to remember a standard name, especially in water, there are a lot of standards in water. It would be great if that could come off of a pick list somehow. And then another thing that we're going to have to do with some of this stuff is there's so much data to massage and interconnect. It'll be beneficial to experiment with AI linking routine related data sets and data types like use cases. And I think we should go slow on that, but it'll help fill in some of those. And we'll probably at some point have the metadata completion be a bit of a conversation with suggestions that are accepted or rejected.
Um, Well, given that you just sort of mentioned the standards and metadata, we're in that topic. I'll ask a question that I think it's Niramala. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Posed, and she writes, "I like the fact that CNRA data requires some metadata for the portal. Other states think I am the picky one when I ask for a list of definitions for model output for models that are used by U.S. states as a regulatory tool. Isn't there some basic metadata and definitions required for models, et cetera, that are released by professional organizations? I find myself calling around the country to ask for what a certain variable means with almost no documentation about every variable. Aside, if anyone thinks the CNRA metadata requirement is too much, they should see the DWR GIS metadata standards." So I see you nodding pretty vigorously, Lucy. So curious if you had a response to this question.
Yeah, I appreciated that somebody tossed in the chat the XKCD comic around standards proliferation. I am of the opinion that people will do important work like metadata creation and standardization if they're given the tools to do it that make it really easy. Um, and so I think a lot about how do we create interfaces for people to do metadata work that don't rely on them, like being in the weeds, pulling information out of PDFs and putting it in JSON. Like that is an absolutely heinous activity to have to spend your time doing. And so I think about the development of software that supports this. I do think there is a potential role for large language models if folks are able to build frameworks that curtail hallucinations, which is absolutely possible. Um, and I think there's a role for technical assistance here, that we just can't abandon data collectors to metadata generation, and say, good luck. And if you don't meet my standards, I'm going to shoot you out. Like, that's not really fair. And so having building the capacity at entities like the state, where when we request particular metadata that meets a certain standard, we have people available to work with you on making it happen. And so the goal for me is in all of these questions, making it the path of least resistance. Of course, that requires resourcing, but we're starting to understand, at least at DWR, that that's important, and thinking through ways to make it real. So I think I might have gotten to parts of the question. I might have lost some of it in the mix, but if my other panelists here have thoughts, I would be excited to hear.
Oh, it looks like maybe there's a raised hand, Elisa. I don't know if we can unmute.
Yep. Let me engage that. One moment. Hold on.
Actually, I want to hear what the other panelists say before I ask if I have a follow-up. I might not have a follow-up.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, so I was going to ask, what I'm asking is California still the leader? Is there really no other states that are making metadata a priority? Have you talked to other states? And why am I the picky one? Because when I started working for Camia Givenchy in 1989, we this was normal, and here we are in 2026, and I think it's very basic, and other states think I'm being picky.
Mhm. So it is really important to track those details about models and other things about data sets and applications. Um, but we really have an extensive metadata uh, standard right now at CNRA, and a lot of the fields aren't used very often, I'm afraid. And so I think what we kind of need to do is to create some flexibility by providing a place where those additional details can be added. So, for instance, just as data dictionary is provided, we could also provide other contextual documentation for a data set. But yeah, it's very important to track that along with the models.
Well, and I know we've got some folks from out of state, and Greg Gerhardt has pointed out in the chat that New Mexico has a robust open water data ecosystem. If there are others, and Lucy, you pointed to state of Colorado. So I think you're getting some answers in chat, and I would invite, I think there are maybe some folks from Texas and elsewhere on the call too, so feel free to weigh in. I'm going to move on to another question here. Brendan Hamilton says, I found that several data sets that we would use are stale, i.e. not updated at their defined frequency, and that this is one of the key reasons that we have not devoted time into building out tools to actively utilize the available data. Are you doing anything to solve or mitigate this issue, such as incentivizing or facilitating data uploads and updates, et cetera?
We aren't doing that currently. You know, most of the data submission is voluntary, and so we're reluctant to nag people. But it wouldn't be hard to have the system compare the frequency of update to the original and current date to create a nagomatic. But we're kind of reluctant to do that. But we could probably figure out something that's gentler. Another thing that we also want to be conscious of is it's great to have perfect quality, and this is kind of a form of quality, I suppose. But it can be expensive, and so it's really critical to make choices like that for or with an appreciation for the requirements of the applications and to document that super heavily, of course. So yeah, we rely on the authors of the data quite a bit.
And that comes to mind actually that I saw in the chat earlier and I can't find it now, but someone mentioned about the user base of data and thinking about in like the creation of data or the publishing of data, making sure to consider the potential end use cases of the data to make sure that we're the collectively are meeting user needs and user expectations. I think there's a similar dynamic that is definitely present in a lot of conversation, where there's a lot of like human-centered design conversation that happens across the board, across the state. This is not specific to the data landscape, but in that same space of our data publishers, what are the types of incentivizing opportunities to make sure that the data publishers we're like meeting them with the right amount of rigor of required expectation in the publishing process. But I don't have the answer in most circumstances of I've landed on a published data set. What does the publisher expect users to do with their data? I don't know this in most cases because I'm removed from the subject matter. I just assume that because it's published, there is an expected use for it. I think that there is really something in this space to be said around, publisher, what do you want to see users do with your data? Is this intended for a research audience that's very specific? I think the individual who put in this question was noting that, like, if there was more current data, they would be doing or building around that data, but because it's stale, it's like not important, like it can't really be built, or it's not worth building at this point. It would be really cool to facilitate those points of, like, we publish this data and we want it to be used in 1, 2, 3 ways. That was a part of the data portal. I think that would be a really cool and maybe like fluffy component, but maybe really meaningful. And then vice versa, instead of just that flag that we mentioned earlier of like, there's a quality issue with this data set, we want to flag it for the data publisher. It would be really incredible to hear from the user community, which is again why I'm eager to get into the space of students, because we have like some, again, control is way too strong of a word, but like could do some controlled flow of communication back and forth between classroom and state environment. It would be incredible to know how users want to use the data. And I think users know that just getting that information to the publishing realm is bigger than it should be.
Mhm.
Well,
I'll add, oh,
oh, sorry, Lucy. I was just, and you can build off of this. I just wanted to note that actually several questions that we got are around sort of strengthening the feedback and communication conversation between data users and data generators and collectors. So I think you're really kind of like, we hit a nerve, I think, on this particular topic, and something that seems worth talking about more and exploring a little bit more. And so, Lucy, feel free to weigh in with what you were going to say. I will note we're in the last 4 minutes or so here, but please, if you have some thoughts on this, share them.
60 seconds. So in the program I work in, I'm developing software developer kits. So in this case, R packages and Python packages that facilitate the process of publishing data, such that when folks are looking to update it, they can do so very quickly by rerunning a pipeline, incrementing the version, and it gets out quickly. So some of it is giving people tools to release data more frequently and easily. And then in that process, by developing a software developer kit, there are assumptions about how people are going to interact with data and therefore how it will be used. And so, Katie, I'm glad you tossed the sort of term human-centered design into the process, because this is where we start to bring in user experience and user interface research, where there are ways to structure tool development, data set development around people's workflows, where if you bring in experts in UX UI work, you can have a really like rapid feedback loop with people about how information and tools are used. So in our program in HRL, we're developing software, we're then beta testing it. We've got a framework for getting user feedback, so that when we are wrapping data and make assumptions about structure, access, and use, we're doing so in a way that is responsive to workflows. So I really do think that there's a role for UX UI professionals in this.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I just will note, I think unfortunately we're sort of in a space where we need to close out the conversation, but I do want to thank the other folks who have submitted questions. And I may be getting out a little ahead of myself here because we didn't talk about this with the panelists, but it seems like we just scratched the surface on a lot of really interesting discussion topics. And so maybe part of what we can do is follow up to this particular data for lunch is try and get some answers, or some thoughts on some of the other questions that were submitted and release those out in blog form or something like that. And maybe we'll have another data for lunch on this topic because there were so many questions that we didn't get to. So I'm so thankful for everybody who kind of saw themselves in this conversation. And I think there was a whole sidebar conversation happening in the chat that I wish I could have tracked more closely, but we'll try and reflect somewhere in our follow-up as well. And just a huge thanks to the three of you for all of your work in this space and for your dedication to putting this data out there in a way that really serves Californians. It's really admirable, and you all spoke so eloquently to that and to the real value in the work that is involved. So thank you. Thanks everybody for being here, and stay tuned because I think there's some follow-up necessary and to come. Elisa, anything I missed before we let everybody go?
No, we just hope to see everyone at the June 17th Data for Lunch later this month. But thank you all so much again. And yeah, we'll send out the recording in a couple weeks and potentially have a follow-up blog. And we've collected all of your questions, so I'm sure we'll be answering them in some way.
Thank you, and thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone.